Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Whiskey Wednesday webcast. It's Wednesday, June 17th, and hope you've had a good week. It's been a nice few days. Nice, cool, able to get outside and work in the yard a little bit, but just a little too cloudy and windy to take all the gear outside and do the webcast outside today. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast.com studio in Haddonfield, New Jersey, and thanks for joining us for today's webcast. Don't forget that you can share your comments and questions for our guests in the chat area. You can respond on Facebook or Periscope and also on YouTube with comments, and we will be able to see them. If you're watching us on Twitter, don't try to respond to the tweet because we won't see that until after the show ends. We have a great panel lined up today, and I want to bring our guests in right now. We have Conor O'Driscoll from Heaven Hill Distillery, the master distiller who works out of Bernheim in Louisville, and Nicole Austin, the head distiller and general manager at the Cascade Hollow Distillery, better known as, or formerly known as, the George Dickel Distillery in Tullahoma, Tennessee. How are you all doing today?
Great, thanks, Mark. Good to see you.
Fantastic. Great to be here.
So what have you been busy with? I know you've been busy with a new project, Nicole, but what have you guys been doing to stay occupied during all of this in and around work while working from home?
Well, there's no shortage of conference calls that Conor imagines the same for you. They manage to find you wherever you are. But it's actually, I have personally really enjoyed, and I feel incredibly privileged to actually be able to spend some time working on those projects that are sort of always on the back burner, things that you just never have enough time to really focus on. I've really enjoyed that.
A little different on our end. We slowed down as the COVID crisis started. We didn't know if we would be declared an essential industry or not. But once we were, we ramped right back up again, and we haven't stopped. This week we're ramping down for our 2-week annual shutdown. And we're crawling with contractors, trying to get production wrapped up. It's heading into probably the busiest 3 to 4 weeks of the year. So it's a little weird to be so busy when everyone else is working from home, but it's an exciting time for sure.
So what maintenance projects do you have on the schedule during the shutdown?
Basically every bearing in the place is either being replaced or just being greased. So a lot of PM type stuff, preventative maintenance stuff. The biggest project we got though, we're doing phase 1 of what will be a 3-year project to completely upgrade, revamp, and replace our milling systems. So we have three mills, one for corn, one for malt, and one for small grains, wheat and rye. And they are old, worn out, undersized. And this year, we're building a brand new MCC and a motor control center, basically a circuit breaker box, if you will, on an industrial scale for that end of the distillery. And we turned the power off on Saturday morning and start the rewiring process. So that's phase 1, is build it, wire the MCC, rewire 67 motors, and then next year new mills, and then the last bits of equipment thereafter, dust collector and grain handlers. So lots going on.
It always seems like when you turn those motors back on, for some reason, more than half of them always are turning the wrong way, right? I don't know how. On sheer chance, it should be 50-50.
It should be 50-50. Well, so of course we're going to start back up on Sunday night, the 6th of July, of course, which is the end of the 4th of July weekend. So everyone's working hard to get wrapped up, including rotation checks, by the end of Thursday. I think that's the 2nd that week. So everyone can have a long weekend to come in and make whiskey again. That's the plan.
That's good motivation.
Yes, really.
You don't get the 4th of July fireworks.
Exactly. But it's cool. I mean, watching these guys work, we're working with Able Construction and Comstock Electric out of Louisville, and they're going at it, and it's really high caliber work. They're working safely, and we're replacing probably 50-year-old, well, maybe not quite that old, but decades old electrical infrastructure with brand new state of the art. So that's pretty exciting.
Nicole, what are you up to during your silent season? I know you've got one coming up too, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's similar for us. There's the summer shutdown where you guys do a lot of PM. We have similar challenges with like antiquated equipment that needs updating. We're kind of taking that piece by piece, warehouse work. But ultimately, I've got a fantastic team, and I think just like Conor, that tends to go pretty seamless and doesn't actually need a whole lot of intervention from me. They don't let me do rotation checks anymore. Where there's a lot of preventative maintenance, sort of standard things, but I've really been focusing a lot on thinking forward about kind of planning for the coming year. So obviously we just released the bottled and bond, and of course I was planning on touring the country to talk to people about that, and so a bit of a pivot on that one. So making plans to try and figure out how I'll be able to connect with people about that, and working on some new releases and trying to think about how I'm going to bring those to market. So a lot of sort of future thinking projects.
I assume you have some of that new bottled and bond in your glass today?
Actually, right now I'm drinking a Dickel 12 highball with bitters and soda.
Oh, okay.
It's summer. It's proper hot here, so.
Yeah, that's cool. Conor, what do you have in your glass?
I got a little Elijah Craig small batch, and because it's summer, I put a huge sphere of ice in it.
And Chris Ratcliffe says, drinking
right.
Elijah Craig in honor tonight.
There you go. Well, cheers to you.
And same thing with Greg. And I just saw a note from Carrie Ann Fuller, our pal in Nashville, here to wish Nicole a happy birthday. Is this your birthday?
It is my birthday.
Well, happy birthday. That's awesome.
I did not know that. I didn't realize that.
That's how much I like you. I'm doing this for my birthday.
Well, happy birthday, and thank you for joining us on your birthday. And since, as I keep pointing out during these things, I play it neutral and try not to play any favorites with our guests. And I'm pouring a little Redbreast 15, and the bottle's almost empty, so I plan to finish this by the end of the show.
Nice. Well, Nicole, you lived in Ireland. I'm from Ireland. You're drinking Irish whiskey. It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's a nod to both of us without actually supporting.
There you go. Actually, I just bought a bottle of that 15 a couple of weeks ago. It's really good.
Oh, yeah.
Lovely.
It's really good. I love Redbreast, and that 15 is spectacular.
I didn't really learn to love Irish whiskey until I was over there. Actually, it was never really my cup of tea, and it wasn't until I was over there. There's something about experiencing it in the pub setting that it's meant to be experienced, and that you learn to love it.
Exactly. Yeah, it fits its surroundings really well.
It does.
And we are getting a bunch of birthday wishes coming in from the audience around the world, from France, UK.
I'm trying to fly incognito with this one.
And Graham Fraser says the EC small batch is for him tonight. And Carrie Ann says that bottled and bond 11-year-old is on fire, if I'm reading the emojis correctly. And I will have my tasting notes for that on the podcast this weekend. But I will tell you that I enjoyed it. I think it's as good if not better than last year's original bottled and bond that you came out with, even though it's a couple of years younger, right?
Yeah. The last year's was 13 years old. So it was fall 2005 was the distilling season for last year's release. And it's fall 2008 for this year's release, which makes it just over 11 years old. But I was saying to you earlier, and I really think like if you were to back the two of them, which you might not guess which one was actually the older.
And Carrie Ann points out that this is the only party we could have given.
It's true.
Socially distant birthday party.
It's true.
And you just came out with another batch of both the Elijah Craig small batch and the Larceny, or Elijah Craig barrel proof and Larceny barrel proof.
That's right. So the 3 a year. We're on the B edition now. It's interesting to compare the two. Of course, the Elijah Craig, a rye-based bourbon versus the Larceny, a wheated bourbon, and aged that long. The theory is they should be heavily like wood forward, but I think what pleases me and kind of amazes me about them is the balance in both of them. And you've got the softer, gentler Larceny, the bigger Elijah Craig, but they're both significantly beefy whiskeys.
Let's go. Go ahead, Nicole.
No, I always love that, right? Like I think we've all beaten the idea to death that age is not a perfect signifier for quality, but you can't help but expect it,
Yeah.
or at least that like wood presence, that sort of like the oaky tannic character. And so every time when it surprises you, it's like, ooh, well, that's interesting. That's nice. That's exciting. Like not what I expected. Even though, if I had a nickel for every time I said that age was not a perfect, signifier of quality. But it still surprises me every time.
Well, there's definitely a sweet spot, that I like that kind of, 8 to 12, which is not really a spot. It's a pretty significant wide spot, but I like that 8 to 12 window, let's call it. You go too far beyond that, you got to be super careful. But that's one of the with as many warehouses and barrels and different environments in those warehouses that we have, that's one of the cool levers we have to pull when we bring out older whiskeys.
I'm still trying to really learn like our sweet spot. I think you're right. Every distillery sort of has one. It's a very personal preference, right? People are like, I really love like our whiskey at this age. I'm still trying to learn what that is for me. The first year's release of Bourbons, so I picked that on sheer, just evaluating blind samples. And I found out right after I released it that John Lunn, who was one of the previous distillers, he also thought 13 years old was like the sweet spot for Dickel, right? So I was really gratified, like, oh, okay, maybe,
there you go.
Although I'm new, like maybe I'm onto something.
Great minds think alike.
right. I was really, I really, really well. I think we benefit from, we have a lower entry proof, right? So we go in at 115, and I think that helps us kind of push it a little bit longer, because typically I agree with you, in New York and in southern climate like this, typically pushing it past 12 years is maybe you're riding a fine edge, but I've actually tasted some really fine things at our warehouses that are surprised me.
And that's what's cool about, if you dive into single barrels, you can do that. I mean, our Elijah Craig 18, I was lucky enough to get a bottle of that recently. And again, you expect heavy wood, and it's just this fantastic bourbon. It's got the right levels of sweetness, just enough smoke and wood, and just the complexity. And it's 18 years old. It should, I say it often enough now, it's kind of becoming a cliche. You kind of expect dirty old stick, but no, it's not. Yay.
I would say it's like chewing on a baseball bat.
Yeah.
A few years ago, before you joined Dickel, I had the chance to try the 17-year-old that was released by your predecessor, and it was a good whiskey, but I will agree with you. I thought it was a little over oaked. I mean, at some point, you get that sweet spot.
And it's so subjective as well. One person's favorite is another person's spit out whiskey. It's so subjective. Like it's who's to say? But to me, like too much tannins is not my preferred way of drinking it. But there's I don't know if you have found the same for but something I have really noticed, and it was particularly impactful in small barrels when I was at Kings County, right? I've seen the effect here as well, as the time of year when you pull it out of cask can be quite impactful for that like really heavy tannic character. Sometimes like I found January, February, that winter time to be the most like, I think the pressure changes in the wood, I don't know what was leading to it, but I found like if I had a barrel that had that as a problem, sometimes if I revisited it in, August, it'd be much better.
Even for older whiskey, where everything should be balanced out. That's really interesting.
Yeah. It was something. I think I noticed it more at Kings County because we had so many small barrels that everything's magnified. Things are just really obvious one way or the other, and we had to plan way ahead because I could hardly pull anything out of cask between January and March. It was a wow. Yeah, even the youngster, there's all tasted like wood. So it was a real learning, and it's much subtler here, but I've seen similar, like depending on when we do our single barrel bottlings.
Note to self: taste whiskey.
Who knows?
This is playing perfectly into a question that Carrie Ann asked. She would love to hear the two of you talk about the vintage aspect of pulling specific seasons for your bonded products, like your new bottled and bond, and Conor, your new Old Fitz bottled and bond series. How do you decide which series and which vintages are going to work the best, given that you've got so much to work with in the warehouse?
It's trial and error is the short answer. I mean, we have, we know what barrels are where and what age they are. We go and sample them, and I can't remember the exact order the Old Fitz come in, but like there was a 9-year-old came out before an 11-year-old or whatever it was. But the contrary to what you would expect to be, but the 9-year-old was ready before the 11-year-old was ready. So we brought that one out when it was ready, and it was the Century panel, the team in Bardstown, Mark, that you've met, Mike Sonny, Toddy Cody, Chris Briney, and that gang. Tasting those and saying, this one's going in the right direction, but it's not there yet. But this one's ready. So there's no standard operating procedure. It's like, is it ready now? And it's either yes or no.
I'm looking at the shelf just out of reach here, and I'm looking at it. It's a 9-year-old bottle that I picked up at the Bourbon Heritage Center about 1.5 years ago. So.
I think the last one we brought out was 13 or 15, I think, and that one was spectacular. It's locked up downstairs.
Everyone on the podcast gets a bottle, right? Like all the presenters, it's like a panelist gift.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah,
yeah, I read that in the notes. And
you just wait, right?
Yeah, I'm sending my address. Thanks.
It's in the mail.
Well, let's go through the origin story for both of you, because Conor, you told us that you originally are from Ireland, and
right.
Nicole, you spent some time over in Ireland. But let's talk about how you two of you got to your respective positions. And Nicole, let's start with you. You started out in New York, right?
I did. A bit of a circuitous path for me. So I started out actually, so I went to school for chemical engineering, not with the specific intention of getting into this industry. I think I was just, mainly I was just trying to be defiant towards my high school guidance counselor, who strongly implied that I lacked the discipline required to become an engineer. Like, I'll show you. And, had to go get a job. It's so inconvenient. And when I graduated, most chemical engineers end up in like oil and gas or pharmaceuticals, and those industries just really didn't appeal to me kind of ethically. And so I ended up in environmental engineering, which I thought was going to be like really sexy and cool, and I was going to be like the next Aaron Brockovich. And actually, that's just code for wastewater treatment, right? Like environmental engineering. Basically, I ended up working at a big consulting firm on wastewater treatment projects in New York City. So I give really interesting tours. Every episode of Law and Order where they're like finding a body in the New York City sewers. I'm like, oh, I've been there. Like, you know where it is? The Manhattan Grit Chamber is it's a fascinating place and pretty technologically interesting. But that's where I started. And I'm sure it would shock no one that maybe I didn't want to be in that industry forever. So I was kind of looking around trying to figure out what I might want to do. And I was in a beautiful bourbon bar that unfortunately has since closed in Brooklyn called Char 4, and sipping a whiskey and being told about it, with all that passion that a great bartender can have. And he was telling me about how it was distilled, and I was like, holy, that's a job that you could just distill? That's literally what I went to school for. Why didn't anybody say anything? This is obviously the job I've been meant to do my whole life. And unfortunately at that time, God, I mean, it doesn't feel that long ago, but it's more than 10 years ago, and craft spirits wasn't really a thing. So it was still, the industry was so in its infancy. And I spent a few years kind of just knocking on doors trying to get a job. And I started with Kings County Distillery. So they opened, they got their license in April of 2010. I joined the company that summer. Basically kind of showed up at their doorstep and was like, hi, I will work here now. They're like, we don't have any money, we can't pay you. And, I was young and dumb, and I was like, that's fine, make me a partner, So that's how I got into the industry. And from there, we kind of grew Kings County. Like, it feels so weird to think about now that craft spirits is so established, but at that time, like, we didn't know if it was going to be a hobby or a viable business. I mean, we all kept our day jobs for the first couple of years and just sort of invested in growing Kings County. And then I did a fair bit of consulting. So it probably will shock absolutely no one that your tiny Brooklyn distillery does not also pay your Brooklyn rent, for your apartment. And then, so I did a lot of consulting. I had the incredible good fortune to work for Dave Pickerel for a number of years. He taught me a lot. I was his first hire, actually, for his consulting company. So I worked with him for a few years, and then, Kings County kind of grew and needed me more. And I did a little bit of consulting on my own, and that was how I ended up in Ireland. So I did some work for William Grant, and they hired me on a 2-year contract to go be the commissioning engineer for Tullamore Dew for the grain distillery that they were building. So I was there from 2016 to 2018, and that sort of was when I got called about this job, and absolutely couldn't say no. I mean, George Dickel is like, it's one of those magical American distilleries, there's nothing like that. Like, it's got that really authentic connection, to the heritage of American distillation, and that, sort of, you can trace the story in one path all the way back to the 1800s. And I really feel lucky to be able to touch that heritage, but without, no one's really come along in the modern era and put their kind of stamp on it now. It's really still waiting for that. So it's a really incredible privilege. So I couldn't say no.
And before we go to Conor, you're going to kill me for showing this picture, Nicole, but I got to show it. If you go to Tullahoma, this is what you're going to see. She's got the best sign. General Manager and Distiller Nicole Austin.
Thank you. Yes.
On the Visitor Center. I don't know if
very, very proud.
that has a sign quite like that in their honor.
Well, I definitely don't. I'm going to have to talk to my boss.
Although I can absolutely guarantee from personal experience that every single one of the operators is going to pick on you.
Yeah, they do anyway. So.
Sorry, Nicole, I couldn't resist.
No, it's fair. Hey, I mean, that's part of the job, right?
So, Conor, let's get your story, because you spent some time in one of the garden spots of America, Terre Haute, Indiana.
Yeah, I did. So how did I end up there? So I'm a chemical engineer too.
Yeah, who'd you piss off to get there?
Yeah, actually, it turned out really well. Clearly, it turned out well for me.
And I grew up in Indiana, so I can say that.
Yes, okay. So I'm tiptoeing through this because I still got friends in Terre Haute. So, so I was hired out of college by Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, and we were making citric acid we're fermenting an Aspergillus niger to make citric acid. It's about as romantic as it gets. And just kind of cutting my teeth there. I didn't even spend a year there, and they asked me to go to Terre Haute, Indiana, to help commission a plant that wasn't so much cutting edge as it was bleeding edge. We were using a genetically engineered bacteria to make the enzyme used to make cheese. And it was actually the first FDA-approved recombinant DNA technology-derived food ingredient, which is a hell of a mouthful. So I was 23 years old. They sent me over there for 3 to 6 months, and it was pretty cool. I mean, it was for a new engineer straight out of school to be involved with something like this was just exciting. So about 4 months in, they asked me to stay, and I had reconnected with some friends from Louisville that I had met on a train in Europe like 2 years before. There's a lot of loose ends that are going to come together eventually here. So I'd been coming in the 3 to 4 months I was in Terre Haute. I was coming down to Louisville on the weekends. Pfizer asked me to stay. I came down. We went down to Dale Hollow on the Tennessee border. It's this great big lake down there, and it was September, and it was one of those perfect Kentucky weekends. Everything was just fantastic about it. And I was driving back to Terre Haute, weighing this decision, stay or go, and it boiled down to I'll stay so long as I'm having fun, because I had had so much fun that weekend. And 6 years later, I quit because just whatever. I had kind of spent my time in Terre Haute. The job had become kind of ho-hum, and I jumped up on my motorcycle and rode across the country. Spent 7 weeks riding 11,098 miles through 23 states, Mexico, and Canada. And ended up in Colorado, spent the winter skiing, turned 30 on the mountain, which is kind of awesome. Then came back to Louisville for the Kentucky Derby and met my wife. Moved in with her, and then still, I'm gonna, that thought, I'm gonna stick around so long as it's fun. And worked for an engineering firm then for 6 years. I'd done production for a while, so kind of like you, Nicole. Let's try the other side of it and see how it goes. That was dull as hell, let me tell you. And the plan B was, if it quit being fun, I was going to go back to Dublin and try and get a job making Guinness, because that would definitely be fun. So obviously now, but yeah, exactly. So, but obviously I was married and I was really enjoying life here. So I started knocking on distillery doors, because if I can't make Guinness, this bourbon thing seems cool. So that was in 2002, and long before the boom or any of that type of stuff. So I knocked on doors for 2 years, and in 2004, Brown-Forman hired me in Louisville. Worked there for 5 years. Then they sent me to a real garden spot for sales, Kentucky, where I made Woodford for 9 years. And
wait a second,
left there.
A lot prettier than Terre Haute.
A lot prettier than Terre Haute, yeah. And Woodford's a lot better than genetically engineered cheese curds. So actually, that process was really cool. If we're going to geek out, we can geek out on all day long. But that's a different podcast. So I left Woodford it'll be 3 years in a couple of weeks, and joined Angel's Envy, was there for about a year and a half, and Heaven Hill called and made me the proverbial offer I couldn't refuse, and been there for a year and a half now, and it's been all kinds of awesome. And yes, I'm still having fun. 30 years later, I'm still having fun.
That's great. Now we have a good question now from Chris Ratcliffe. How much do Nicole and Conor watch what the craft distillers are bringing to the table, and what do they see which is exciting and they'd like to explore? Now, Nicole, you obviously cut your teeth in craft distilling, and I just want to point out, we have a couple of your friends on the chat room. Mike Blaum from Illinois. Nicole is our spirit animal. E.P. Wood from Colorado, not to mention our queen. And I know you know both of those guys, so I know you know what's going on in craft distilling, and you don't need to take inspiration from it because you were helping inspire a bunch of these folks at one point. But what
you did know
the craft world?
I mean, that's what's great about craft. Some of my best friends are still in that industry, and I think we all share inspiration. I think give and got so much from all those folks, and it's so important to me actually to still stay connected with them. It's they're just good people, top to bottom, and I'm really, really proud to still be kind of considered a part of that industry. And actually, when it was announced that I got this job, I was at the American Craft Spirits Association convention in Pittsburgh when the news was being made public, and I was so nervous that everyone would be mad that I went to work for Diageo, right? Not see me as an outsider, and then I wouldn't be able to stay close with all these people that I cared about so much. And everyone was so supportive and proud, and I think just really excited that one of their own had kind of made it to the big leagues, and it meant so much to me. And the joke that PT is telling about, so we have just a small industry group of friends and folks that help each other out, and we sort of tongue-in-cheek nominated a king or a queen that year, and I was queen of the good guys last year, but I've since handed it over to Mike. So Mike, when I'm still going to throw you in a body of water when I see you next. Tradition is tradition, and it's important to be honored. But I watch closely what they're doing. I mean, I think there's a difference, right? Something I've really seen, inside of this company is that it's quite difficult to do things on a really, really small scale. that sort of true experimental, leading edge, try something and not know if it works. It's hard to do that. That's not really what large companies are set up to do. And, I'm working on kind of creating a pathway to make that real. But something I always felt so incredible about craft is, you're kind of more set up to try things and not care if they fail, and not worry about getting egg on your face or, some generations old grandfather of yours like rolling over in their grave because you messed something up. You're just a little more willing to try things, and sometimes it leads to really surprising outcomes. Like there was I was a judge at the American Craft Spirits Association tasting this past year, and there was this hopped whiskey that, like, I don't like hopped whiskey, right? It's been a trend for a while. I've never liked it, didn't understand why people did it, don't think it's good. I tried one this year and it blew my mind. It was so good. It was like, it was citrusy and bright and interesting, and it just showed me that it's possible, So I really try and stay pretty close to what's going on there. Also because I like them.
Conor, I know you guys produce a lot of whiskey at Heaven Hill, but I know that you also that you guys consider yourselves to be craft as well, because it is still a craft to produce good whiskey on a bulk scale.
I mean, that's a really good point, Mark. I want to echo what Nicole said. I mean, yeah, it's super invigorating to watch what the small guys, or if you want to call them that, the artisanal guys are doing, guys and gals are doing. But we do pride ourselves on being craftsmen and craftswomen at the distillery, even though we're doing it on a 1,300 barrel a day volume. But it's good whiskey doesn't happen by accident. It really does have to be crafted. I mean, all the variables that go into the ingredients, the variables that happen during the production, then you're at the mercy of the weather in the barrel in the warehouse and time. So there's a lot of craftswomanship goes into that. So, but watching what the new guys are doing, I mean, it really is invigorating. And we were part of that at Woodford as well, but barrel finishes, crazy mash bills, hopped whiskey, who'd have thunk? It's not,
never liked it.
Yeah, I've had some pretty horrible hopped whiskey too. I haven't had a good one yet, so I'm interested in what that one might be. Because I like hopped beer,
Ian Aldous wants to know which hopped whiskey was that?
I'll look it up. It won a gold medal from the American Craft Spirits Association judging this year. So if you were to look on the website for American Craft Spirits Association, they list all their medal winners, which you should do regularly anyways. But go ahead and look it up. It was I had never heard of him. It was a distillery I had never heard of, just came out of nowhere and produced this really shocking spirit.
We have a question from Greg in Paris, and he says, a bit stupid, I recognize, for both. If Kentucky is USA's Speyside, what would be USA's Isla area or state, if you think this comparison is relevant, of course. Now, he's talking obviously about a peated comparison, but there are so many different categories and so many different types of whiskey being made around the states that it is kind of interesting to take a look at that. What would be the U.S. version of Isla?
I'm not sure there is a straight answer to that.
Yeah, I want to see Conor.
I don't know is a short answer. I mean, I think there's been some discussion lately, like, do we need to have like regional designations for American whiskey? Like, is there a Pacific Northwest versus a Southeast or whatever? Racking my brain here. I haven't tasted any. Like, obviously, Isla peated stuff is so far out on one end of the spectrum. I think of. Honestly, I don't know. There are craft people doing the artisanal guys doing some crazy stuff. Copper and Kings here in Louisville, but they're making brandy. But if you could put it in the still and put that in the barrel, Copper and Kings are doing it. So I don't know. Maybe them.
To answer the quick question about it was suggested from Greg, who said, do they make whiskey in Hawaii? Yes, they do. Ko'olau Distillery in Hawaii on the Big Island is making bourbon right now that and blending some of their stuff with stuff they source from the mainland, but they'll have their own bourbon out in a couple of years. As a matter of fact, I think we can actually say now that there is whiskey made in all 50 U.S. states.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Because I know I just got an email from some folks up in Juneau, Alaska that are making a single malt that want to send me a bottle of it to try. And having lived for a few years in Alaska, yes, I want to try that. I want to.
Yeah, really. I want to try it. Yeah.
I feel like the last time I looked, it was like there was like one of the Dakotas still didn't have any or something. So we're close. Maybe we're there. That would be so exciting to me.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And also points out, good whiskey doesn't happen by accident. It's carving gold in front of the distiller.
Words to live by.
I think, like, as silly as it is, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? And I wonder, I mean, we were taking that question quite literally, right? Like, where do you find peaty whiskey in the States? But I actually use that metaphor of, like, as Islay is to Scotland, you know, quite frequently, right? Because Islay it's Scotch whiskey, right? Like, we understand it as Scotch whiskey, but it's got its own strong regional identity. And I use that metaphor a lot. So I don't think it's a silly question. I think it's an interesting question. And, you know, to my mind, I mean, I guess I'm quite invested in it because obviously I make a Tennessee whiskey, which is a regional identity of bourbon. So, you know, of course, my answer is going to be Tennessee because I want to claim that mantle. But, you know, I think there's, like, if you were to just take the metaphor of, like, what is taking this category, you know, sort of bourbon whiskey to, like, a really, to an extreme, right? Like, if that was the metaphor you're using, not so much about peatiness. You know, I think Tennessee's got a shot at that, and Texas also is probably one that I would point to. You know, they've got quite a strong body that's really generating a fairly coherent regional identity. And it's, of course, I also, you know, I'm quite invested in Empire Rye. You know, I helped Christopher create that category, which is rye whiskey from New York. And I'm really invested in that. I find regional designations quite useful. I think they're really useful for consumers because it's such a broad shelf. And, you know, to be able to try something that you like and feel a certain degree of confidence that you can try something else and also like it, I think it's a really useful tool. So I'm really excited to see all the kind of emergence of regional designations, you know, American single malt and, you know, New York, Texas. I think Missouri just passed a state law defining, you know, Missouri whiskey and what that's about. So I think it's going to be incredibly useful, you know, as these get established.
And of course, we have a smart alecky comment as usual from Bill Ricker.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Greg says that thanks, Nicole, and you guys nailed the question he was looking for. And Dave Kuhn looked and checked. The gold medal winning hopped whiskey was Dark Door Spirit of IPA. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does. And it was, I highly recommend. I have no idea how to get a hold of a bottle. I just keep desperately talking about this whiskey and hoping that someone's going to send one to me because it was really good.
And explain what the Empire Rye was, because you hinted at that, and we talked about the show a couple of years ago when it first came out. But explain what that really was, because it was an attempt to create a unique style.
It was, yeah. It was actually quite an interesting spot to stand in, like, to define a style, knowing that your sort of intention and greatest hope is that this is still relevant 100 years from now, you know, you're like, man, what kind of ego do we all have to be sitting around, you know, sort of trying to define like a category. But I think it was quite useful, right? So it was 6 of us, so 6 producers, and Christopher Williams from Copper Seed really led the charge. So he should really get the bulk of the credit. But we all sort of sat down and said, you know, what standards could we identify that would ensure that it's distinct, right? So, you know, if it's just like every other rye, then the category doesn't have meaning. So we had to kind of pick things that would make it truly distinct, have a genuine connection to the place that it's from. You know, if you just pick something like bottled in, then the liquid doesn't have any kind of tangible connection to the sort of regional designation that you're applying. So we thought about how do we make sure that it's truly connected to New York, and how do we make sure that it's of quality? You know, how do we do something to protect quality? And we thought a lot. You know, we had a lot of back and forth debates and conference calls around, you know, what was going to work and not work. And I think one of the smartest things we did was, rather than trying to codify it in law, you know, we started out by basically creating just a nonprofit company that we all sat on the board of that controlled the IP for Empire Rye. So it allowed us to make changes, kind of to tweak it if something about it didn't work. And we actually did make use of that. Early on, we kind of copied from Bottled and Bond the idea of seasonality because we thought that was quite interesting. But if you're a small producer, that's not really practical, like to, if you're making a rye just to put it in an Empire Rye blend and, only half of your barrels are really ready at the same time, like what do you do with the other half, right? So we changed that rule, about a year in. And I was really grateful for that flexibility. And I think that's what's going to give us kind of longevity. So the hope is that identity, we really kind of codify it and establish it over the next, say, 10 or 20 years. And then get it, hopefully, eventually codified into law, part of the Code of Federal Regulations. So that would be the ambition. And I think it's quite relevant. There's some critical restaurants in Manhattan who've actually made Empire Rye. They're like house whiskey. So I'd say it's successful early on. There's more and more people joining.
And Conor, I want to bring up just a quick point for you. You said 1,300 barrels a day. Can I correct you on that? 1,301? Given what Jody does downtown at the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience, which truly is a small artisanal distillery.
That is true, 1,301. Well, yeah, we're 1,300, 1,350, whatever it might be. But yes, the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience makes 1 barrel a day. And they can pivot. They can. Jody is, he's making crazy mash bills. He's doing all kinds of fun stuff down there. But yeah, they make 1 barrel a day.
Do you ever get to go over there and just play around and just to have some fun?
I get to go over there and just kind of be there. It's fun to be there. I mean, I'm not going to, hey, Jody, I'm going to kick you out of your kitchen and I'm going to be the chef now. Like I go there and hang and see what he's doing. He's got a cool little, pot still set up with the rectifier on top of it. It's neat to see what he can do with that stuff.
But do you ever get to use it for experimental stuff just to test something out?
Not deliberately like that. I mean, Jody and I will talk from time to time, and there were we source different smoked malts from like a beechwood smoked all the way through it was dark coffee colored and flavored like roasted malts, and he kind of took that idea and bought enough of each one and made whiskeys with each one. And the distillate was really interesting because, very mild smoke all the way up to, black coffee basically. And but we recently hired a young lady called Abby Long at the Bernheim Distillery in our quality department. And she and I and Jody are starting to work together on just what you talked about there. Like, how can we leverage the smaller capacity at the UB, as we call it, EWBE, Evan Williams Bourbon Experience, smells UB. So how can we leverage that smaller capacity to, give us some directional idea of what a whiskey might taste like? Because at the Bernheim Distillery, our smallest unit is 124,000 gallons. Each fermenter is 124,000 gallons. So it's hard to experiment on that scale. But that's kind of in the pipeline.
And that brings up a really good question, because we talked a lot in the past about how yeast affects flavor. But how does the smoking of malt affect the flavor? Because both of you only use a little bit of malt in your whiskeys, maybe 5 to 10% at most, just to help with fermentation. How much difference does it make?
It matters. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Nicole. Yeah, go ahead.
It doesn't take much. Those heavy peated malts or even those heavy roasts, it does not take much. Distillation it concentrates flavors, so it really does not take much to have a pretty dramatic impact on the distillate. I've definitely tasted some early experiments of folks who tried to do something like a 50 or 60% like chocolate malt, and you're like, whew.
Too much.
Yeah, no, walk back.
No, and it can be. So we typically use 12-14% just regular malt, distiller's malt, as for the enzyme package for the conversion. Then if you're adding a smoked or roasted one, for as a flavor. The more you roast and smoke it, the less enzyme activity it's got. So it's purely for flavor. And exactly what Nicole said. I mean, I've made some whiskeys where, the heads and tails left over, well, hell, we're going to distill it again. Just put that back in the beer well and run it through, and we'll add it to bourbon. Yeah, well, maybe about a week later, those heads and tails are gone from the system, and now you've got this interim whiskey that's neither the original one nor the follow-on bourbon. It's like, well, we got another experimental product. Let's see how that ages out. So, but yeah, they can those smoked grain flavors really stick around.
I mean, at 3%, you'll see something like notable.
Yeah.
We have a good question from Tyrone Cote in Nova Scotia. Whiskey production has been growing worldwide at a time when we are seeing more duties being imposed as part of trade wars. Do you think there's the risk that a whiskey lock is developing again? And just some historical perspective, the whiskey lock that hit Scotland back in the early 80s when nobody was buying whiskey was what led to the closure of places like Port Ellen and Rosebank and some of those distilleries back in the day. So are you concerned at all about the future?
Not really. I mean, if you look at, I think everything is vaguely cyclical, and the statistics we throw around when this type of question comes up is, bourbon is not as big now as it was in the 70s when it was really big. There are more drinkers of legal age now than there were then. We've barely scratched the overseas market, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the biggest difference, though, is that all of us are being super deliberate about how we grow the business, how we grow our portfolios, how we connect with consumers, how we make our product. I mean, there's nobody that I know of is doing anything to cut corners. It's all quality focused, and that's what's going to win. That's what's started this boom, is people looking for authentic, quality, handmade, crafted, all those adjectives. And I know we're all. I mean, I'm not doing this to cut corners. I'm doing this because making great whiskey is fun as hell. And so I think that's pretty much the vibe I pick up across the industry.
Nicole?
Yeah, I think we're kind of too small at this juncture, at least at Dickel, to be heavily reliant on export. So ultimately it's not something that I personally think a ton about. And I think at the upper ends of whiskey, it's like relatively elastic. So who's to say like what the actual impact would be? But I think probably the bigger concern right this moment is a lot of the small guys, who are so heavily reliant on their tasting rooms as a really key like cash flow. And certainly I worry more about them just this moment.
We have a quick question just following up on the UB, the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience, Connor. Chris Ratcliffe wants to know how long that one barrel ages for. He needs to check his calendar and emails. None of those barrels have been bottled yet, as far as I know, right?
That is correct. No, we're tasting them regularly, and we'll bottle them when they're ready. Is the short answer. I mean, again, the perfect segue from my previous comment about quality. I mean, we're not going to bring out something that's not where we want it to be. So it's in the near future, but by near future, it could be a year or two. They've been producing there for, I think, somewhere 5+ years now. I forget exactly, but it'll be ready when it's ready, but hopefully soon.
And from what I understand, it'll probably only be sold at the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience and maybe a few retailers in Kentucky. It's not going to be anything widespread.
No, I mean, the volume, 1 barrel a day is just, there's not enough to go around. So come to Kentucky. We'd love to say some whiskey here.
And go down to Tennessee. They're right next to each other. It's
do the loop. Yeah.
You're awfully bold to tell people, right? Like, of course, I guess you have to, but that's fine. You got to keep it close to the chest when you're trying something. So, like, when is it going to come out? I have no idea.
Yeah.
Eventually, right? It's an unsatisfying answer.
We have a question from Dave Kuhn. As a creative director, I'm very interested in the package design that goes into the product side of whiskey. As head distillers, do you have much input or even interest in that side of the business? do you care what they do once it goes to the bottle?
I care very much. I have gone through long since kind of gone through all of the stages of grief on the fact that the liquid alone is not what makes a whiskey successful, right? If only. And thank you. I hope that you're holding up that bottle because you liked it.
It was on my desk and within reach. Last year's version is about 3 feet out of my reach.
I was quite involved in that though, and actually, one of the reasons I took this role is, I was really excited that it's I think fairly unique for a big distillery that like they really created a role that touches all parts of the business. So I have responsibilities on kind of the operational distillery side as well as the sort of sales and marketing side because. To me, it was hugely important to understand both, kind of knowing that that's such a big part of what makes a whiskey successful. And I took quite a hand in the design, although I'm an engineer, so not an artist. So I rely quite heavily on people who are actually talented in that area for inspiration and direction. But I'm a real control freak, so yes, I absolutely do.
And just to be equally fair, Conor, how much input do you have on this?
I inherited this bottle. I had nothing to do with it. So
beautiful, bro.
It predated me. But I like this one. I mean, it's a good looking bottle.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's the same for all the Elijah Craigs. And I'm not even going to try to stretch because I will fall over and knock us off the air. But the no.
Can he do it? Can he do it?
Oh, I am so good.
Oh, that's the good looking bottle.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
That's a beautiful decanter. And I know
so that's a 1957 decanter. Apparently in the 50s, decanters were big. Every brand was bringing out one, but that's a reproduction of like a 1957 Old Fitz decanter. And that back then, the whiskey was made by Stitzel Weller, and we've heard through the grapevine that's pretty much an exact replica. So
it's beautiful.
And the whiskey inside is really good.
Yeah, it is really good. Greg wants to know from Paris, do you know, Conor, what happened with the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof 12 when Phil and Deepa from Whiskey Mysteries YouTube channel traveled all over Scotland with a bottle of it to make people try and see what U.S. distilleries can do? I'm not familiar with this one myself, but let's see.
I have never heard that, but you know what? I know what I'm doing tonight.
Man, no one over there. It's such. I don't know if you still go back, but when I was spending time in Ireland, people did not know anything about bourbon over there. I actually had the master blender from William Grant when I was over there. Spent probably 30 minutes with me trying to figure out a polite way to ask how to make bourbon good. It's like, no, you're kind of missing it. It's not supposed to taste like scotch.
One, open your mind.
Yeah. I was a real uphill battle trying to share my affinity for bourbon over there. I think it's growing a little bit, but I would love to watch that because I would love to see people's reactions over there trying some bourbon whiskey.
I'm gonna have to look out for that. That would be great.
Graham, go ahead.
No, I was done.
Graham Fraser points out there's some really great bourbons and whiskeys around today, but many of them are out of his price range in the UK. Mm-hmm. Blame the tariffs, guys. That jacked up 25%. And
but here's the point on that, Mark. And I'm going to steal this phrase from my good friend Bernie Lubbers, who's our global brand ambassador. And it's his birthday today. So, hey, you got the same birthday as Bernie Lubbers. Oh, my goodness. I just put that together.
Oh, happy birthday, Bernie.
And Bernie has the Bottled in Bonds tattoo on his right arm.
Yes, he does. But
they're good spirits anyways.
It must have been an auspicious day or something. I don't know. I'm a January guy. What do I know? People go crazy for the unicorns. I mean, the old Fitz decanter you had there. People go crazy for it. And they're clambering up the shelves to try and get to that unicorn on the top shelf. And they're clambering over gold bricks on the lower shelves. I mean, just because it doesn't have a fancy age statement, to your point earlier, Nicole, just because it doesn't cost an arm or leg doesn't mean it's not good whiskey. there is tons of whiskey out there that is, 4 to 8 years old, $15 a bottle. And, of course, $15 a bottle here is probably, 25 pounds in the UK or whatever it is. But even still, reasonably priced stuff that is spectacular. And it's great to taste to have the unicorns and enjoy those, but don't trip over the gold bricks on your way to the unicorns.
Dickel 12 is my go-to. I mean, $24.99. I drink that all the time. I know everyone probably says that, but I have such an appreciation. I don't know about you, but I have a closet full of unicorn bottles, and you just have a tendency. There's something you like. You just want that good whiskey that doesn't make you feel like you're trying too hard. That's where I live. That's where I like to be.
And we have a great comment from Tyrone Cote. If you like rye, try Alberta Premium Cask-Strength for a dill explosion.
Dill.
I don't know if you guys have tried that one, but I have tried Alberta Premium a number of times over the years. It's only sold in Canada right now, but oh yeah. I mean, it's from Beam Suntory. It's from their Alberta distillers in Canada, and yeah. And
I now have an inn in Alberta. We bought Black Velvet a few months ago, so I have to talk to my buddies up there. And
yeah, they should be able to get you some, but or you should arrange for a field trip.
Well, once we can travel again, I've been up there. It's a cool little medium-sized distillery. A bunch of great people up there, but it's a long way from here.
Oh, it's not that far. I've been to Lethbridge, Alberta.
It's a long way. Yeah, I'd say it's not like the other side of the world or anything, but you can't get there from here, basically.
You can't drive.
Maybe I'll take my motorcycle next time.
Years ago, when we moved up to Alaska from Houston, when I took a job at a TV station in Anchorage, we literally drove from Houston to Anchorage, and it took about almost 2 weeks to do it. Wow. But we literally drove through Lethbridge, and this was before I became a whiskey geek, or we would have stopped at the distillery.
Wow.
But we drove through Lethbridge, Alberta. It's only about maybe 30 miles north of the border.
Yep.
The U.S.
Here I was giving you credit. I was like, man, you went all the way there just to try the whiskey and see this distillery.
And as Pete had pointed out, it's a long way from here. Yes, that depends on where you're at. And Mike Woods says, happy birthday, Bernie. Davidson Rye out of Nashville, but really made in Indiana at MGP, is full of that flavor. It's so weird. And I've on the rye thing, I've talked with Don Livermore, who makes a lot of rye at the Hiram Walker Distillery up in Windsor. And he says dill is a fault, and it shouldn't be there.
Right?
Is that a point of debate among distillers, or is that the case? Or what's your take on this?
Sure. I mean, there's some highly sought after German Rieslings where cat pee is a flavor note that is considered appropriate to be present, right? So, if wine can get away with that, I see no reason why rye can't have dill in it.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's in the taste buds of the beholder. I would guess the argument that it's a fault would be that kind of vegetal flavor that might be, wet grain or something like that. But I mean, there are off notes in that realm. But you get an aged whiskey that, I love finding that mint note in a bourbon. Like, who the hell put mint in here? Where does that come from? So if mint could show up, why not dill?
It's a fault if that's not what you're going for, right? Like if you have some repeatability, right? Like you want someone to buy your whiskey and it should be the same or close, every time, which is so hard, right? So if yours doesn't have that, and then one day it does, that's the problem, right? But if that's a signifier or something that you were going for, well, then the opposite is true. If it always has that and one day it doesn't, that's the problem. So.
Then there's that old joke between Parker Beam and Jimmy Russell where they were listening to somebody rattle on about all the tasting notes, and locally Parker goes to Jimmy, gee, I didn't put all that crap in my whiskey. What about you? And I'm trying to find the question here because there was a really good one. Yes, knowing that Conor is a fermentation specialist, and you just recently got a grant, I believe, to do some kind of fermentation research. Graham Fraser wants to know, I keep reading that bourbon producers use multi-strain yeasts in fermentation, unlike Scotch. has this always been the case? I don't think it's multiple strains as it's proprietary strains.
Proprietary strain. So, we have the Heaven Hill strain, and that's the strain that goes in all our mash bills, all the 5 mash bills we make. Different producers have different strains. Like Four Roses talk about their 7 yeast strains, and
5.
we could talk another hour about the influence of yeast. But yeah, yeast makes all the alcohol and a good chunk of the flavor, and without the stuff that the yeast makes, it's not going to be there to distill. It's not going to be there to put in the barrel, and it's not going to be there to mature out. So it kind of is the DNA of the distillery. So find a strain you like, find one that expresses your distillery's personality, and go with it. And there are commercial strains out there that people use that they didn't scrape off a tree in the backyard or whatever the story is, but they produce great whiskey too. So it's the thumbprint, it's the DNA, it's the identity. So
well, when you were at Woodford, you guys used open top fermenters to catch some of that wild yeast, right?
Well, we had open top fermenters, correct, but we had a very well conditioned and loved and nurtured Woodford Reserve strain of yeast that we made sure that any local yahoos blowing in didn't stand a chance. It was all our lovingly controlled Woodford yeast.
And as Dave points out, if I wanted a pickle, I'd eat a pickle.
Yeah. Well, you've seen people put pickles in whiskey and whatever nastiness that is. So yeah.
I've never seen anybody put a pickle in whiskey, but I'd smack the crap out of it.
Yeah, really.
Me.
I'm not sure why not?
I mean, I've heard of a pickleback, but I wouldn't drink that either. So
that's where I was going for, is pickleback. So yeah.
And as Carrie Ann Fuller puts out, not true. Davidson makes their own rye, which makes that fake news, obviously.
There's a lot of commercially available yeast strains. Like all the commercial folks that I know are really working to expand their offerings. Like as specialty yeast becomes more interesting, like they're working to expand just like what's commercially available. There's a lot of more variety than there was 10 years ago. So
yeah, absolutely. And I like talking to those guys because the yeast is passion A, whiskey is passion B. Literally, it's in that order.
Every guy who calls himself the yeast whisperer.
Yeah, I'm a proud yeast geek. I'll talk all day about yeast if you want me to. I've got my it's my sourdough starter is at least 10 years old. It's bubbling away downstairs. So.
Ooh. You were making bread before it was cool.
Okay. Explain in 30 seconds malolactic fermentation.
It's the thing they do in wine to give it whatever wine flavor they want to do, and we don't mess with it in bourbon because we don't need to.
Works for me. Somebody made a reference to that the other day. I'm going, wait a second. Okay, you just can look. I'm going to admit, I have absolutely bleep all experience when it comes to chemistry. I basically slept through high school chemistry. My poor teacher, Mrs. Skirvin, God rest her soul, let me slide by because she knew if she flunked me, she was going to have to deal with me again for another year.
Become a distiller. Next
to the last class of the day, it was in the afternoon, and I basically would come in and put my head down on the seat and on the table and for the hour. And she let me through, God rest her soul. But if I'd known then that I was going to be talking about distillation and fermentation and all this stuff for a career, I would have paid a ton more attention.
See, and that's chemistry, not even biochemistry, which is where it really gets interesting.
I mean, you can learn stuff all the time. Like I saw a really interesting study, and I don't know if they've ever done anything like this in whiskey, but I saw a really interesting study on VinePair about they were doing some studies, like now that DNA sequencing is cheaper, they were doing some studies on if you dose, right, in wine, some of them don't dose with the yeast and some do, and they wanted to know, is there such a thing as a winery house style? Are there native yeast that are native to certain microclimates? And so they were testing wine fermentations and found that even in some really commercial conditions, so where you would think everything would have been super controlled, where they were heavy dosing with sulfur before the grapes went in, and like CIPing the tanks, and the fermenters were closed, and like, fully automated kind of commercial operations. That even there was 2 of those where they found that there was in fact a native strain that was like becoming quite present very early on in the fermentation that was not dosed with commercial yeast. And as that result always stuck with me, I thought was really surprising. Like, that you would not expect to find that in those conditions. And I've always sort of wondered if, or I guess just assumed that the same was true in whiskey. And I'm dying to one day get the funding to answer that.
I think it probably is, Nicole. I mean, I know some of the studies. Right? Some of the studies we did at Woodford, and I hope to do it at the Bernheim distillery. Like the goal is to get our yeast in there doing its thing and being as productive and as predominant as possible. But as the fermentation progresses, and our Heaven Hill yeast or whatever your house strain is starts to peter out, other stuff is going to get in there. And that's, within reason, there's super interesting things can happen there because, do you get a wild strain of yeast that produces that special flavor? Do you get a bacteria that does something potentially positive? Usually bacteria are going to not do anything positive, but, you hear about late souring. The Scotch like to talk about late souring in their fermenters, which is a bacterial contamination at the end, and it gives the whiskey. The answer in Scotland is always character. It gives it character,
And Greg also points out, not sure Conor knows his Elijah Craig barrel proof 12-year-old, which isn't 12 years old anymore. The nickname in the whiskey community is the Bottle of Wow.
I know it now, and I'll use it. Thank you.
And he was also pointing out it would be great to see Conor and Don Livermore sitting down for dinner to talk about yeast. It would take 10 hours, but it would be a great dinner.
It's a great dinner. I like Don. I've had a couple of conversations with him. He's a good guy. And he knows his stuff.
Go ahead.
He knows his stuff. He's a piece.
That's cool.
Travis Adams says, I made my first rum with infected dunder recently. After 26 years of brewing sanitation, I now believe magic happens all the time in fermentation. Rum without it is vodka.
That's pretty cool. I don't envy whoever is responsible for emptying and cleaning that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think maybe dunder is like the sourdough end of the bourbon market. I mean, you can make just fine bread with not sourdough, but bread made with sourdough is infinitely better. So maybe that's what the dunder factor is.
I know Todd Leopold's messing around with it for whiskey, and I'm sure it's going to be lovely.
Yeah.
And we're getting comments about people referring to the barrel proof as the hazmat bottle. And Greg says, no idea what hazmat means, which language that's short in English for hazardous material, which means it's really strong.
Yeah, it's whiskey above 140 proof is technically hazmat. It's anything above 140 proof is technically hazmat. So,
which is 70% ABV for those of you not used to the proof thing around the country, around the world. But I haven't seen many whiskeys above 140 proof. There's a couple out there.
We don't get there in Tennessee.
No. It's actually not that. There's a couple. They're not really that much fun to drink that way because they're hazmats. They are so high proof. All you can taste is the burn. Now you start diluting them, maybe they're interesting. But the first hazmat whiskey, the first 140 plus proof whiskey I had, I was smart enough to put a lump of ice in it. The ice sank. That's how low density it was. I was like, oh shit. I'd never seen that happen before. It was like a stone. It's like point. It's like
that should be rather odd.
Dave Kuhn says, you guys were number 1 and number 4 in Whiskey Advocate's top 20 last year. Did you do anything fun to celebrate, or is that just a cherry on top of the hard work? And I was in New York with you and Nicole last year for Whiskey Fest a couple of days after that was announced. So I know you had a lot of fun. Conor, what did you guys do to celebrate number 4?
Well, we were in New York at the same time, and I tried to get close to Nicole to say hi and congratulations, but it was 6 deep all night long, so I just went about my business. But we were pleased with the number 4. That was the 7-year-old bottle and bond. But yeah, that was a the Whiskey Advocate Awards are super fun, and it's an honor to be nominated, but it's great to win.
I was pretty floored.
Yeah, I saw you in New York. You were having fun.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And I took my mom out after around the city, and she went to bed that night and said, "This was the best night of my life."
Nice.
That meant a lot.
And Bill Ricker, our resident smartass, points out ice will sink. Okay, next time I need to reduce some Everclear for disinfectant use, I'm going to start with a bar, cube, or sphere. A good use for ice, I think.
Yeah. Give it a shot. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, water, ice floats in water because it's less dense. High proof alcohol is even less denser. So
we had some folks earlier talking about opening up a bottle of the Parker's Heritage Collection. You know where I'm going with this, Connor. What's up, store? What's here?
Nothing up my sleeve. I'm not at liberty to say, and we haven't actually chosen the final candidate yet.
Bullshit.
But Nicole, what was your line earlier? I don't even know. But no, seriously, we have. Let me see. What's the best way to put this? We have the two candidates right now. There is a really interesting barrel finish, and that's not by interesting. I mean, it's a cool barrel finish, and then there is a really funky blend of some of our mash bills that's not been done before, and it showcases both. It's completely unique, and that's all I'll say.
Which one do you like?
Probably, honestly, the blended whiskeys. I think because it's so unique. Barrel finishes were unique a few years ago. A lot of people are doing them now. I haven't this one style of barrel that we're using. I don't think I've seen it used a lot, so that kind of sets us apart. But definitely the meddling in our mash bills was definitely I preferred that one. So,
and I'm gonna throw a controversial question out here because somebody asked about Ezra Brooks, which is not a Heaven Hill product. And Greg on Rao says, I just read that Luxco sourced everything but Ezra 7 barrel proof from MGP and Ezra 7 barrel proof from Heaven Hill. Would Connor admit it? You may not even know because it may be above your pay grade.
It was before my time. That's all I'll say.
Okay.
But it's good whiskey.
I'm just bringing it up. Nobody accuses me of censoring the questions. So let me ask you just one final question. What's the most recent whiskey you've tried that you really enjoyed that you didn't make? Somebody else's whiskey.
You want to go, Nicole?
Recently, I mean, that hop one still blew me away, but there was also Kings County when I was over at the World Whiskey Forum. Ryan, who took over for me, brought a bunch of samples, and I have to say that the student has outdone the master.
I think I tried one of those. Those were good.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing really, really fantastic work.
Just have to write down all these recommendations and go buy some whiskey.
Oh, endless. I will trade you for.
There you go.
Be a list of craft recommends.
Yeah, I like it.
What happens in the whiskey industry, folks, if you're watching, I mean, distillers do this all the time when they're talking with each other. This is not unusual. You see this every day, and it is really what makes the whiskey industry cool. So, Connor, what's your favorite whiskey that you didn't make recently?
The most recent one was that Redbreast 15. It resonates with my genetics, I guess. But I've always liked Redbreast, and that I decided I'd splurge and have myself a quarantine whiskey splurge, and get some Redbreast 15, and it lived up to the billing. It's fantastic.
And Chris Ratcliffe points out, and we'll close it off with this: the meddling in our mash bills is the title of
Deal. I like that. Thank you.
And Peated, almost every evening I enjoy whiskey that I have not made. Gee, thanks, Peated.
Drink to that.
Conor, Nicole, thank you for joining us tonight. Nicole, have a happy birthday.
Yes, Nicole, happy birthday.
Yes, I'm not going to sing because
Nor am I.
it will be an obscenity, and we can't do that. But thank you both for joining us. Give me just a second here to say goodbye to everybody. I hope you'll join us for our next webcast on Friday afternoon, 5 p.m., the Happy Hour Show. Davin DeKergamo will be with us, the Canadian whiskey guru. We're going to talk about Sazerac's acquisition of Collingwood and the Canadian Mist Whiskies and the Canadian Mist Distillery in Canada from Brown-Forman this week. We'll also talk with Sharon Boone, who's a whiskey blogger based in New York, and we may have a few other surprises for you as well. Thanks again for joining us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast. You can always keep up with whatever we're doing at whiskycast.com. And don't forget to listen to the podcast this coming weekend. Until we meet again, I'm Mark Gillespie. Thanks for joining us, and sláinte, guys.
Sláinte.
Cheers.